There you go. Now I'm going to go ahead and share the screen, and hopefully everybody sees the as-is residential contract for sale and purchase. I'm sorry, Bonnie, you don't see it?
I do now.
I see it.
Okay, great. It's up now. Great. Thank you for letting me know. Again, for those of you online, I can't see the chat all the time. So if you do have a question, please don't just hesitate to just go, excuse me, and we'll listen. We've got a couple people, 3 people here, so that's good. Here and there, it's all good. All right. So as we get started, are there any general questions or specific questions that we want to make sure get addressed, or things that you've seen from this that have caused some confusion or that need additional clarity that we want to make sure that we get addressed? And please throw those out so we can make sure that we talk about it. Anything? Okay. All right, cool. Then we're at it. Let's go for it. All right, so this is the form that we'll be using, that we'll be recommending for our policies, is the as-is residential contract for sale and purchase. This is the Florida Realtor one. It is bar approved or Florida bar approved, so that's a good thing, but it is developed by Florida Realtors. Please note, as a reminder, the NEFAR documents will be sunsetting at midnight on the 30th. So this will be required as of the 1st. I've had questions on, will we be updating the packages? Yes, we'll be updating the packages. You'll probably start to see some of these forms appear in the packages. And that's probably going to be the best way for us to manage this. We'll start adding these forms to the packages, and then when the other forms are sunset, they will be removed from the packages. Please just watch. We'll need your help, probably about a 24-hour window there to get things in and out. But watch for the change in forms, and as of the 1st, please make sure that you're using the Florida Realtor forms. Been a question not related to the purchase and sale agreement, but to the listing agreement. Do we need to change the listing agreement, or are the previous listing agreements considered grandfathered in? The previous listing agreements are considered grandfathered in, but there are terms and conditions that will change. I would not recommend doing any amendments to the listing agreements as of the 1st of July. I would probably wait until the final versions, or until, excuse me, the next versions of the Florida Realtor listing agreements and purchase sale agreements come out in the middle of July. So we'll be watching for those. The good thing is that if you get acclimated to these forms now, then you'll only need to be concerned about the changes that occur in the rewrites of them. I'm trying to think if there's other questions we've been getting. I think that's it, unless somebody else has another question that's popped into their head. Okay, so for familiarity, let's just kind of go through this. A lot of what's going to be different in here is that the paragraphs are just in a different order. So a lot of the same terms and conditions are covered. Some paragraphs are in a lot more detail. That doesn't mean it's much different. It's terminology in some cases. But please note that the as-is residential contract for sale and purchase pushes most things to the riders. This is why we spent time on the riders this past week, is that the riders become so integral in the purchase and sale, or sale and purchase, however you look at it. So the first thing we talk about are the parties. Really no difference. You're going to identify the seller, you're going to have to identify the buyer. We do not have to identify marital status. This is something that's very difficult, it seems, for people to push out of their scope. We don't have to identify the marital status of either of the parties at this point of the purchase and sale agreement.
Okay.
I have to get used to saying sale purchase agreement. You'll notice it says on lines 3, agree that the seller shall, and the seller shall sell by the seashore. Anyway, that the seller shall sell and the buyer shall buy the following described real property. One of the major differences in this section versus the NEFAR purchase and sale agreement is this does not identify any assigns successors,
Right.
where the NEFAR purchase and sale agreement identified successors, assigns. So that has been pulled out of this, that doesn't mean that doesn't apply. This is still a once executed by all parties and delivered. This is still a bilateral contract, so all parties are obligated, and things don't die unless the parties agree to dissolve or remove themselves from the contract. Property description, really not much of a difference in the property description other than it's coming much or a little bit earlier from the NEFAR purchase and sale agreement. Street address, city zip, located in, please make sure you're getting the right county and the right tax ID. This does impact others in the transaction. It impacts the lender, it impacts the appraiser, it impacts the surveyor if one is required or if one is being used. So, and then the real property description, pretty much the same. You know, if it's longer, go ahead and attach the more lengthy description. There's not a problem there. This is very similar to what we currently have, although under the property description, instead of personal property being a separate paragraph, personal property is now included in the real property description. So you'll see item 1C is the real property description as in legal description. And then it goes on line 12 to indicate together with all existing improvements and fixtures, including built-in appliances, built-in furnishings, and attached wall-to-wall carpeting and flooring, which is identified as real property, unless specifically excluded in paragraph 1E or by other terms of this contract. Because we all use the listing agreement slightly differently, where the listing agreement identifies personal property, that has been removed from the listing agreement. So again, we're pushing everything to the sale and purchase agreement. So the negotiation of personal property would be a part of more specifically a part of the sale and purchase agreement. Not that it wasn't always, but there were options in what would be included in NEFAR where it's lined out here, not really any opportunity to say this item or that item. Highly recommend that either in the additional terms and conditions paragraph, sale and purchase, or in some other form that we may actually be offering, that you identify what these items are, because it can be vague. And I think we've all experienced something being replaced prior to closing or something being taken prior to closing. But here, notice it says range or range, oven or ovens, refrigerator or refrigerators, dishwasher or dishwashers, disposal, ceiling fans, light fixtures, drapery rods. So this is that section in NEFAR, the NEFAR purchase and sale agreement in paragraph 16, almost identical. So those things would stay, but some of the items that are listed here have been moved out of the selection area in NEFAR and are just lined out here. So if there's a concern about a particular refrigerator or a particular item that is attached, please make sure that your buyer is specific about what they intend on having when they purchase the property, so that the seller is clear. Other personal property items included in the purchase, line 21, are, if there are things that are vague, I would make sure that they're included here. If this is where you want to put the description of the refrigerator, like Samsung side-by-side or a four-door refrigerator, it's probably not a bad idea to do that. And then line 23, where personal property is included in the purchase that has no contributory value and shall be left for the buyer. So that's just identifying that those items that are staying have no value. Excuse me. I will say that this does not address any of the smart home features. So again, I like that our purchase and sale agreement does identify some smart home features. If you're working with the seller, I would highly recommend that they clear out any codes and any smart home tools that they're leaving with the property. We need to make sure that we advise buyers and sellers that smart home features customarily stay the property because they're attached. That would be the keypads on the doors. That would be any outlets that have been changed out to be smart home features. So smart home items will probably need to be addressed if it's not amended or changed in the new purchase and sale agreement. For paragraph 1, is there anything that you have seen or heard in other courses, classes, or questions that you want to make sure get brought up regarding the property description and personal property?
Um,
One of the classes that I was in, they said, write everything, do an attachment and make sure you, even though it's in that paragraph above, write everything.
Okay, so Diane was saying that at one of the classes that she was at, they recommended using an amendment to amend the features that were listed as personal property for greater description. So write it all down, be clear, be concise. I will tell you that currently there is no blank writer. There's no blank amendment or addendum writer. So hopefully we'll see that with some of the changes. If there is no blank addendum, or if you want to add information, there is the additional terms and conditions paragraph within the sale and purchase agreement, or you would need to add a page and then identify that page within this section or within the additional terms section. So great suggestion. Anything else anybody wants to add? I'm sorry, I think Bonnie may have started to say something I spoke
No,
over.
I'm good. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? All right, let's just move on to the purchase price and closing. So broken out slightly differently. This is flipped, kind of like the way that it's flipped, because remember, these numbers should add up unless it's 100% financing. If it's 100% financing, these numbers won't add up. But in most cases, these numbers should add up. So the purchase price, just identified as US currency. The initial deposit is to be held in escrow in the amount of checks subject to collection. The initial deposit, then it talks about the initial deposit. Currently it says herewith, which has been confusing for some people, but the initial deposit made payable and delivered to the escrow agent, which is named below. Just for clarification, the escrow agent is holding the money. So when you get closing instructions attached to a property in MLS, those closing instructions are telling you where they intend on closing the property. There's not an obligation to put the binder at the closing company. There is no obligation. Is there an ease of the process? Yes. If the monies are held at a title company or attorney or in an escrow account outside of the closing company, you as the agent do have to make sure that the monies get moved to the closing company at least 3 to 5 days prior, right? So it puts an additional onus on you. But a buyer providing escrow funds has the right to have those funds held wherever they would like. It cannot be dictated by, unless a seller dictates it as part of the negotiation. But the closing instructions you receive in MLS are there for the purpose or the ease of, this is where we plan on closing. If your buyer is comfortable, if the buyer is comfortable putting funds with this closing company, attorney, whatever, then we're offering it out to you. But we were recently in a discussion because the listing brokerage was insisting that the money be held with the title company closing it, and the buyer said, I don't want to put my money there. And they have every right to say that. So just for clarification purposes, is there an ease? Absolutely. It's one less thing you, as the individual working with the buyer, would have to worry about. In other words, getting money from one party to the next. And as a listing agent, if it's not held where you're closing, then that is something that you as a listing agent would also need to make sure that the agent working with the buyer is doing. Excuse me. So check one, it's accompanying the offer or is to be made within a certain number of days after the effective date. Notice the default is 3. So in this case, it's automatically setting the default to 3 days, and this accompanies the offer or is made within 3 days. Then it identifies the escrow agent, common terms for the escrow agent, name, address, phone, email. Fax is not as integral in it. However, if there is one, please add that.
Effective date
Are we
is,
okay?
effective date is the same as acceptance in this contract?
It is, and it does identify. it is acceptance, yes, and identifies it in a, it actually identifies the effective date in 3B.
Thank you. Oh, okay.
Excuse me. Yeah, so it'll define it for us so that we're all on the same page. You are correct in those two terms being the same. Item 2B identifies if there's any additional binder that's going to be deposited. So if the buyer has elected to put a binder down and more than one deposit, we can identify it as an additional deposit. And then C is for financing, expresses a dollar amount or percentage. So that's slightly different. You may see percentages in there. So for example, if the buyer is getting an 80-20 loan, they may put in 20% here. This will cover you in negotiations that you will not have to change this line item. If they come in at 600,000, you end up at 620, the 20% down remains the 20% down. So use it as works for the situation. Anything else under D is other. This would be financing by a seller. This would be other types of financing that are being engaged in. And then E is the balance due at closing, which does not include the buyer's closing costs, any prepaids or prorations. Slight difference that we may not be used to is by wire. So it identifies by wire transfer or other collected funds. So what's the balance due at closing? Balance due at closing being expressed as a dollar. So the only place that we're looking at slight differences, of course, is the loan going to be a flat dollar amount or is it going to be a percentage? We okay on purchase price? Any observations or things that have come up?
On D, when you say other, would that be a hard money one?
Yes. Question was on D, would a hard money lender be included there? That would be yes on that one. Okay. 3 is time for acceptance. So it's laid out a little differently in the sale and purchase agreement. If not signed by the buyer and the seller and an executed copy delivered to all parties on or before. So acceptance and the effective date are defined as having not only executed copies, but delivered. And remember, because the timeline is not defined in the sale and purchase agreement, it's 11:59 and 59 seconds. So we have to be concerned about when the delivery also takes place. If you're doing electronic signature, of course, the delivery goes back immediately once there's full execution. It goes to all parties. So is that considered delivered? In most cases, that would be considered delivered. So it can change the effective date. If it's not delivered to all parties until, let's say we get it signed at, one party signs at 10:30 p.m. and then the other party doesn't sign until 11:58 p.m., but it's not given back to party one until the next morning, well then that's the effective date, would be the next morning, would be the effective date, versus that night when it was all executed and then not delivered. So this defines it as delivered. It has to be delivered back. But with electronic, and it doesn't say you have to be aware that it was delivered. Remember, so if they signed at 11:58 and it was done electronically and shot back to everybody by 11:59, then the effective date is that date and day one is the next day.
Where we go by the delivery date on that transaction?
It would go by the delivery date from the electronic signature. Yeah. Yeah. But people are still doing wet signatures and people are still doing, sometimes more comfortable getting things signed in front of each other. So you have to make sure that everybody's aware when that occurred. This offer shall be deemed withdrawn. So if it's not, whatever date is put in here as the final date for the offer to have it accepted and delivered to all parties, if we haven't met that date, then the offer is deemed withdrawn. And this goes as far as saying, and the deposit, if any, shall be returned to the buyer. This is kind of nice because in our current situation, it doesn't state that, and what it states is that if the binder is not deposited, or if it's defaulted, if it's not there, then it can be a default. Then the seller or the other party would have to go after the binder in an outside process. So this says, if any, shall be returned to the buyer unless otherwise stated. Time for acceptance of any counter offers shall be within 2 days after the date of the counter offer is delivered. This is fairly extensive, and this section here doesn't allow us to change that.
It used to be 24 hours.
Well, the default was
Default.
24 hours with a blank to fill in. So know that, if there's not a sense of urgency or a sense of urgency hasn't been created, individuals have 2 days, 48 hours to respond to counteroffers. Now it's written in here as a hard number. Can you change that? Yeah, you would have to cross this out and put something under there, and it'd be initialed by all parties, or add it to the additional terms and conditions. The counteroffer shall be responded to within 12 hours, 24 hours, whatever. But since it's written hard without a change or without an opportunity to change that, you would have to change it in a couple of different ways. Again, I'm not a big proponent of scratching things out, but you could at least add it to the additional terms and conditions. And then it goes on to define the effective date as the date of this contract shall be the date when the last one of the buyer and seller has signed or initialed and delivered this offer or final counteroffer, which is now the effective date. Anything anybody wants to add to time for acceptance? Slightly different, but just be aware of some of the changes. Timelines, right? 48 hours. Closing date. The closing date of this transaction shall occur when the funds required for closing are received by the closing agent and collected pursuant to Standard S, and all closing documents required to be furnished by each party pursuant to the contract are delivered, which is called the closing, unless modified by other provisions of this contract. The closing date shall occur on. So this is where we would be identifying a specific date. Question did come up the other day. Can you write or before and a specific date so that it says on or before a specific date? Yes, you can. So you can write on or before for the flexibility. Please note that unless modified by other provisions, if you don't say on or before, then if the date changes, you need to amend the contract, because remember all of these items. So you have to start thinking about this. If monies aren't delivered, whose responsibility was it to get those monies there? Did the buyer not do something that they should have done in order for the monies to be delivered? Because if the monies aren't delivered by the time the date that's identified, then could the buyer be potentially in default? Yes, they could be. So please watch that. This requires for modifications. It doesn't allow us to say on or before, it doesn't have the option for on or before. It doesn't have the option for a certain number of days after effective date. And it doesn't have the acceptance date option. So that the NEFAR one provided 3 options. This is date specific. Please watch your date specifics also. And when we get into loan approval, that's going to be the next thing that we're going to need to watch. Because if your date specific is before the end of your loan approval period, you've created a conflict in the contract. So extensions for closing, this is a little shorter. So it talks about the CFPB guidelines. This is the requirements for the when they give the initial good faith estimate to the buyer, and then the closing disclosure that comes at the end. If there's difference of a greater than 0.5%, it has to be redisclosed, and the buyer must sign off on that. In the event of force majeure, this is related to wars or conflicts. So those two are identified as automatic extensions here. Very similar to the NEFAR one, a little less detailed. We're okay? Okay. Occupancy and possession, unless paragraph 6B, so we just have to go down to here, check if the property is subject to lease or occupancy after closing. Gonna have to run over a couple of things here. So unless paragraph 6B is checked, occupancy after closing, does not say pre-closing, so watch that. The seller shall at closing deliver occupancy and possession of the property to the buyer free of tenants, occupants, and future tenancies. Also, at closing, the seller shall have removed all personal items and trash from the property and shall deliver all keys, garage door openers, access devices, and codes as applicable to the buyer. If occupancy is to be delivered before closing, the buyer assumes, so here's your pre-closing, notice of pre-closing, buyer assumes all risks of loss to the property from the date of occupancy, shall be responsible for and liable for maintenance from that date, and shall have accepted the property in its existing condition as of the time of taking occupancy. See rider T, which is the pre-closing occupancy by the buyer. Okay, just as kind of a reminder, the riders, both T and I think it's U for the seller occupancy after closing. So T is the buyer occupancy before closing. U is the seller occupancy after closing. One of those addenda are required if that's going to take place. But I will tell you that neither of those addenda are the official occupancy agreement. Each of those riders, excuse me, I have to get away from addenda, each of those riders indicate that the party responsible will have a document executed by a third party. So it is still the responsibility of the party asking for occupancy to have an agreement drawn up by a third party. And we ran into this the other day. There are brokerages out there that have created their own pre and post occupancy agreements. We do not use those agreements. Those agreements are not to be used for our customers. Those agreements are designed for the brokerage and are slightly leaning towards the benefit of the party that the brokerage is representing. So if you have a buyer that would like to move in before, contact the closing attorney and ask the closing attorney to prepare one. Or have them go to an attorney of their choice and have them prepare an agreement. Because we noticed that some of these agreements, pre and post occupancy, created by the brokerage themselves, leaves things out that could put a party at a disadvantage. So please make sure that when you're working with the customer has the right to have their occupancy agreement created by whomever they like, not to be forced or to use an occupancy agreement created by a brokerage as a personal. If the brokerage wants to use that for their customer, that's fine. But for your customer, we do not create them. We do not recommend we recommend using ones created by an attorney or type.
So if our buyer wants to use one of these, say they want to occupy beforehand, we would have to do the rider for it, and then it would get created after it's accepted? I mean, or do we do it before?
Question is, when do we do the agreement? Well, it has to be done. So it doesn't say anything about the buyer agreement, but the seller agreement has to be done 5 days from the effective date, which is line 76. I would anticipate both being done at least 5 days from the effective date. But the other question is, so we need the rider and an additional agreement? Yes, the rider just puts all parties on notice.
So I checked in with her yesterday. She got funding was sent yesterday.
I'm sorry, Nick.
She texted me.
Nick, would you mind muting yourself, please?
Hey, 1 second, Buzz.
Thank you. So the rider is solely to identify that one party would like to occupy prior to, or another party would like to occupy after. The rider itself does state that an agreement, a lease agreement, needs to be created. So you do need both. Thanks for the clarification. So the first part does talk about the buyer occupancy. Then check here if the seller would like to occupy. The other part that's covered in here is if this is a short-term rental and there's going to be occupancy. In other words, maybe it's a short-term rental and future occupancy has been already slated. you'll need the agreement for short-term occupancy. S or something like that. Let's see, make sure. Excuse me?
Somebody circled that. Your document, is that you or?
No, I didn't do that.
It's
Who circled 78?
Christie.
How did you do that?
Oh,
Hello,
it's
the
in there.
ghost or something.
No, who did it?
It said Christie, but
No. Christy, you out there?
is this a
I
shared document?
am. I didn't realize that
Okay.
it was gonna show up on the whole screen, so I'll take it off. Hey, how are you?
That's all right.
I
That's
can do
cool.
that, I can do that.
That's cool. See, I can, yeah, I should get my pen. So she was talking, here, I'll highlight. So within 5 days of the effective date is for the 7th. And then there's the rider that talks about short-term addenda. Or excuse me, short-term occupancy. Let's see it right. Oh, short-term, no, that's short sale, sorry. Oops. Seasonal, sorry, item DD, which is the seasonal or vacation rentals after closing. That would be part of this also.
So that's if it's used at the Airbnb and you already have booked rentals
Yep.
and you couldn't cancel them,
Yep.
then you'd have to do that.
So-
Okay.
Question was, would that be related to things like Airbnb properties? Yep, that's the seasonal rentals, item DD. Anything else anybody wants to add? All right, assignability, that's paragraph 26 in our current purchase and sale agreement, but it just basically states that the buyer may assign and thereby be released. We find this most often in warehousing companies that are using equitable title to go under contract with another property or attempting to go under using equitable title to sell the property at a profit. May assign but not be released. So this is the default in the NEFAR purchase and sale agreement. Or the option is may not, the third option is may not assign the contract. And if none of the boxes are checked, the default is different. The default is then the buyer may not assign. Then the buyer may not assign this contract. So slightly different default.
You may
I'm sorry?
not assign, right, from the NEFAR?
So the difference in the NEFAR is that the current default in the NEFAR purchase and sale agreement is that they may assign it, but not be released from liability. The default in the sale and purchase here for the Florida Realtor is that the buyer may not assign. So financing. So are we okay to move on to financing? Anybody? All right, financing. So this is a cash transaction with no financing contingency. Remember the first one in the NEFAR one, it kind of tells you that certain items are going to be removed. This just tells you the financing contingency is going to be removed. Or you've got B, which is the contract is contingent upon within a certain number of days, 30 days if left blank. So please remember, since we are now looking at a date specific for closing, please make sure that your loan approval period is within at least 5 days before that closing date. Days are the days after effective date, which is the loan approval period. So this is now the loan approval period right here. The buyer obtaining approval of a conventional, so we identify the type of loan or other, or money lender, seller. Mortgage loan for purchase of the property, and we would need to check one. Fixed, adjustable, fixed or adjustable rate in the loan amount, which is paragraph 2C, which is where we would identify the loan amount as part of the purchase price. At an initial interest rate, so again, if you can choose fixed, you can choose adjustable if they've already been pre-approved or pre-qualified by a specific lender. You can choose fixed or adjustable so that they have the option. At an initial interest rate not to exceed a certain percentage. If you would like to fill that in, or if the buyer requested that be filled in, that's fine. Because if this is left blank, the prevailing rate based on the buyer's creditworthiness will be sufficient. And for a term of, if less than 30 years, you can 15, or if it's more than 30 years, you can identify that. Otherwise, the default is 30 years. I'm not a big proponent of leaving blanks, but in this sale and purchase agreement, there are some places that it may make sense to leave blank. I mean, this is 30 days would not be unusual. This I would probably leave blank in most cases, depending on who you're working with. I mean, if you're working with the buyer may want to say, I don't want to pay any more than 6.5. And if the seller accepts that, then doesn't say about anything about points though. So they might still get 6.5 with points. So I don't know.
I know if rates go up, the seller could say, I'm gonna buy it down, so you still are in contract.
Could, or the buyer could buy it down. The seller could request the buyer buy it down. Absolutely.
If you leave
Excuse me.
this, if you leave the term blank, okay, and they decide on, it automatically goes to 30 years. But what if the buyer decides to go 15 or 20? That's not a, we're not in, we need an addendum for that, or can we just leave it alone?
Technically, you should have an addendum for that to change the number of years. It's not impacting, as long as it doesn't impact the seller, probably wouldn't have to have anything done. And
Because you
everything
might
would be
not know
fine.
that till closing. I mean, that they changed their mind.
Yeah, we just had one change from conventional to cash. We did an addendum to the contract, indicating that that change occurred.
But
So
that is
if
a
there's
significant change. This is only a change that affects only the buyer, right?
potentially, I don't know, if the seller has agreed to pay points, are the points more expensive or less expensive?
And I agree there. Yeah, you're right about that.
What if they don't qualify now for a 15, but they try to do the 15 and then, it could cause, because the payments are gonna be higher, so their debt to income ratio could change. Maybe they can qualify for the 30, but they can't do the 15 and it changed and you didn't tell the seller.
Right, but if you didn't amend this to change from
Okay.
15 to 30, if the seller didn't agree, excuse me, if this was left blank, like Bonnie was saying, if this is left blank, then the anticipation is a 30-year loan.
Right.
The seller is agreeing to a 30-year note. If the buyer then chooses to go to 15 and we don't amend this to 15, then if they don't qualify for 15, then they would still have to do the 30. If we amend it to 15 and they don't qualify for the 15, then they have to renegotiate with the seller, if they were able to qualify for the 30. So there are reasons, I mean, as Bonnie said, and as you're saying, there are reasons to amend it, and there may be a reason not to amend it.
Right.
Buyer's mortgage broker or lender having received an appraisal. Now, notice here we talk about an appraisal, but this is not an appraisal contingency or alternative value of the property satisfactory to the lender, if either is required by the lender, which is sufficient to meet the terms required for the lender to provide financing for the and proceed to closing. This is not, please note, this is not an appraisal contingency. There is no appraisal contingency in this sale and purchase agreement. There is a rider for an appraisal contingency as it relates to convention. The rider for FHA and the rider for VA both contain an appraisal contingency. But for cash and conventional, this document does not contain an appraisal contingency. You would need rider F for appraisal contingency. Buyer should make application. So we've got the loan approval and then the application. In other words, buyer should make application. And again, still 5 days if left blank from the effective date. Use good faith, diligence to obtain the approval of a loan. Meeting the financing and appraisal terms of paragraph 8B1, 2 above. They do a lot of referencing back, but if you're just looking up or down, it should get you there fairly easily. Back to the loan approval. Buyer's failure to use good faith and diligent effort to obtain loan approval during the loan approval period shall be considered a default under the terms of this contract. For this provision, diligent effort includes, but is not limited to, timely furnishing all documents and information required by the buyer's mortgage broker and lender and paying for the appraisal and other fees and charges in connection with the buyer's application for financing.
Define that.
Excuse me?
I said, I like that they defined.
Yeah.
Mhm.
There's a similar definition in NEFAR too, which is great. The buyer shall, well, great because it's going away, so, you know. The buyer shall, upon written request, keep the seller and broker fully informed. So it says here, buyer shall, upon written request, slightly different, right? So the buyer shall, upon written request. So if you, as the listing associate, are trying to follow up with what the buyer is doing to ensure they're doing what they're supposed to do, these requests are going to need to be made in writing. This document does push a lot more to written, 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 written. So very important. And just as a point of clarification, I get that we do a lot of texting back and forth, but texts are not considered, if something should be brought to a third party for a dispute or over a dispute, texts are not really items that are considered strong in a case. So please confirm things in email. Even if we have a text conversation, please confirm things in email. And that is written and is legally sufficient.
So that could be an email.
Yes, please. If you have a text chain, then please confirm that text chain to the other party via email.
What exactly are you showing them to show that they applied for a loan in this?
So if you're the listing associate, you may be putting in requests. Can you please confirm for me when the application was made? Can you please confirm for me when, how we're doing on loan approval?
Oh, okay.
So you can do it to the buyer, you can do it to the lender, you can do it, but it should be in writing, making that formal request.
Okay, I don't got to show them an official document from the loan officer.
If I'm the listing
As a-
agent,
as a-
yeah. If I'm the listing agent,
Okay.
I would like that. Yeah.
Okay.
If I'm the listing agent, I want to know that you're doing what you're doing. So if I say to
Mhm.
if I say to the buyer's associate,
Mhm.
because in most cases you're going to go through the buyer's associate to get to the buyer as respect for the process. So I might say to buyer's associate, I'm requesting confirmation that the buyer has made their application. Can you please confirm and provide proof? And then
Okay.
that would be their responsibility to do that.
Got it.
At this point in the transaction, the buyer should have provided the appropriate documents to get pre-qualification or pre-approval. Can
Okay.
you please provide me with confirmation from the loan officer that that has been made, or maybe you copy the loan officer on that request?
Pre-approval,
Yeah, go ahead, did you finish?
the pre-approval letter, would that be proof enough? Or?
Well, the pre-approval letter means that they've spoken with and provided some documentation. Pre-qualification means they've spoken. So you want to make sure that they're continuing, even if I have a pre-approval
Oh.
letter, there's still additional documentation that the lender is most likely going to need in order to provide final approval. Or clear to close type of clear to close confirmation.
My question was, if you're emailing the lender and you have a listing, do you have to copy now the other agent or the buyer so that they know that you're asking? Or,
Well, the way that this is written,
Yeah.
it should probably go through the listing associate.
so we can't go
So,
directly now
I mean,
to?
I don't think there's a problem going to the lender, but I think all parties need to be aware.
Okay, so
is
we
the
need
way
to
that this
copy
is
every.
written. Right. And I think further on it talks about well, it puts the onus back onto the buyer. So I don't remember any place. If anybody remembers a place where it says that we can contact the lender, but as long as we notify the parties that this is what we're doing, or request contact information for the lender, and it's provided, there shouldn't be an issue to contact.
Because I usually like to actually speak to the lender.
Yeah, I think
So we can still do that. I
you should be
mean,
able to.
but
I
it's
don't think
not
there's
in
anything that
writing.
says we can't, but I think what we need to do is take the step to say to the buyer's associate, may I go ahead and get or if you've already been given the pre-qualification,
Yeah.
pre-approval letter, and say,
I
just
claim-
putting you on notice that I'm going to contact for confirmation or for introduction or whatever. But we need to make sure all parties are aware.
Yeah.
You know,
I think
because-
that's what happened. I don't remember.
I'm sorry, Bonnie, go ahead.
Should that be a counterback from the listing agent to the selling agent? Or from the seller to the buyer?
I don't think it needs to be a counter, but I think that if you put an email together that you put it to the buyer's associate notifying them, because most of us are asking for pre-qualification or pre-approval letters at the time of offer, which
Okay.
provides us with the names of the individuals. I think it's just probably an extra step that we have to think about doing, is sending an email that says, thank you for the information. You know, at this point, now that we're under contract, I will be contacting the lender directly to introduce myself in case anything is needed. Something that just puts everybody on notice in
So
writing.
would that email leave us open till the closing? Because I mean, you pretty much said I will be in contact with the lender. So,
Yeah.
or do we have to do it every time that we call?
No, I think once, you know, if
Yeah.
you say, you know, I'll be contacting them during this process,
Okay,
you know, I think that,
because I've had to call a million times.
sure, I think that we all have to connect with the lender more than once usually in the process, or that they're connecting with us, which is important.
Ask for
But I
acknowledgement
think that,
from the other agent, no? Ask for acknowledgement
I
from the
think,
other agent.
yeah, yeah, I think that's a perfect way to put it, that the email is more of an acknowledgement, and set up for, this is what I'm going to be doing.
Yes.
So that everybody's on notice, so nobody gets pissy.
Mhm.
And it does state that the buyer authorizes the buyer's mortgage broker, lender, and closing agent to disclose such status and progress and release preliminary and finally executed closing disclosures and settlement statements as appropriate. So the buyer is authorizing us, those individuals, to do that. But I think it's probably a good process to at least include them in an initial email that outlines what your plans are, out of respect and just to keep everybody on the same page. If within the loan approval period, the buyer obtains loan approval, the buyer, so this is slightly different. So if within the loan approval period, this is another good reason to contact the loan officer. Buyer obtains loan approval, the buyer should notify the seller of the same in writing prior to the expiration of the loan approval period. Or if the buyer is unable to obtain loan approval within the loan approval period, but the buyer is satisfied with the buyer's ability to obtain loan approval and proceed to closing, the buyer should deliver written notice to the seller confirming the same prior to the expiration of the loan approval period. So this is a little different. So if they get loan approval early, currently there's no obligation to notify. This says there's an obligation to notify.
So now we have to notify them no matter, at any time once they have loan approval.
Once they get loan approval, according to the contract, we have an obligation to notify the seller through, of course, the listing associate, right? And if they don't have loan approval by the end of the loan approval period, we have an obligation, the buyer has an obligation to put all parties on notice that they are going to continue moving forward because they believe that they're going to go ahead and get loan approval, even if it's after the loan approval period. If the buyer is unable to obtain loan approval within the loan approval period or cannot timely meet the terms of the loan approval, all after the exercise of good faith and diligent effort, the buyer may terminate this contract by delivering written notice of termination to the seller prior to the expiration of the loan approval period. Right? So if they're not going to be able to get loan approval, they have to do that prior to the loan approval period or extension of the loan approval period. Yes. The buyer is not in default under the terms of this contract. The buyer shall be returned the deposit, thereby releasing the buyer and the seller from further obligations. You'll see in this document that it often states that the buyer shall be returned the deposit. Buyer shall be returned the deposit. We still require a termination of contract where all parties agree to the disbursement of the funds. So that would be the seller's opportunity to state, unless they're not making any claims and the contract holds. So that would be where they would have to terminate and ask for money. The seller is going to be asking for any monies when it's non-default. If the buyer fails to timely deliver any written notice provided for in paragraph 8B, or excuse me, 8B3 or 4 above to the seller prior to the expiration of the loan approval period, then buyer shall proceed forward with the contract as though paragraph 8A, come back up to 8A, financing contingency, just so we're kind of trying to track anyway. So 8A, there we go, above has been checked as of the effective date, provided, however, seller may elect to terminate this contract by delivering written notice. So it's seller can now go ahead and say, okay, bye, we're going to go ahead and terminate, delivering written notice of termination to the buyer within 3 days after the expiration of the loan approval period. Slightly different. Remember, the buyer had an additional 3 days to notify the seller if they were going to either take the property as is or move forward, right? Additional the time frame. Oh no, I'm sorry, I lied. We took that out. It was 5 days and we took that out. So the buyer had to, the NIFAR contract, the buyer had to notify prior to the end of the loan approval period. This gives the seller the option to terminate within 3 days if the buyer has not provided information. So now adds the seller in there. If the buyer has timely provided either within notice, either written notice provided for in paragraph 8B3 above, the buyer thereafter fails to close on this contract, the deposit shall be paid to the seller unless failure to close is due to the seller's default or inability to satisfy the contingencies or the property related conditions of the loan for the loan approval, specifically excluding the appraisal valuation, have not been met unless such conditions are waived by other provisions of this contract. So slightly different, right? So not the appraisal value, but those repairs required by the appraisal, which is kind of a contradiction because usually those repairs are required in order for the property to meet the appraised value. The seller, thereby releasing the buyer and seller from further obligations under this contract. The assumption of existing mortgage, you need additional rider D, or the purchase money note or mortgage to the seller, you need a rider C. Right, so this is all under financing. So how we're going to purchase the property, what responsibilities the buyer has. If the buyer doesn't perform, is it a default? If the seller's not put on notice for an extension, the seller can cancel. If the buyer doesn't provide an extension, they're agreeing to move forward. Very similar to what we currently have, but outlined a little differently and a little bit more detail. Anybody? Something you heard in the class that, okay, moving forward, closing costs, fees, and charges. Here, the main difference is it's not a checkbox thing. It's all outlined. So these are the customary closing costs for a seller and the customary closing costs for a buyer. In the Florida Realtor purchase sale agreement, main difference being the survey, which is now pushed to the buyer versus the seller. So in our market, it was traditionally the seller's expense. It is now most commonly the buyer expense. But the items are pretty much the same. You know, the doc stamps, owner's title policy, title search, municipal lien, charges if it's a foreign investor in real property, HOA condo association recording, sellers, attorneys, very similar. Same with cost to buyer, taxes, recording fees, notes, recording fees, owner's policy, owner policy and charges, survey, lender's title policy. Excuse me.
Clark, can I ask you a question
Yes.
real fast? On the survey, if the seller
sure.
does still have one, that's a limit, can the seller still provide one they already have?
You would have to add that because I think if you come down here to survey, it says at least 5 days prior to the closing date, the buyer may at the buyer's expense have the real property surveyed and certified. If the seller has a survey covering the real property, a copy shall be furnished to the buyer and the buyer closing agent within 5 days after the effective date. So yes, they can go ahead and provide that. It doesn't make it contingent on the title policy though.
Right.
So just be aware that it doesn't state that if it's not sufficient to produce title, that a new survey will have to be performed.
And that would be the buyer's expense. Okay. Did you jump ahead or did I miss
It
that
would be.
earlier? Okay.
No,
All right, cool.
You're
Thank
good.
you.
you helped us move along a little faster,
Oh, okay.
which is cool.
Hey. No
If
offense.
there's anything else that the buyer or the seller are paying for, put it into other. This would be where you would identify points. This would be where you would identify percentages towards closing costs. this is not the place for concessions related to seller paying buyer brokerage. This would be for anything related to closing costs other than buyer brokerage compensation. Anything else you want to add?
How much is that survey? What you can rate?
At $450 up. I mean, if it's a large parcel, it could be $800. If it's a couple of acres, it could be $1,200. I mean, it depends on.
Thousands.
The question was, what's the cost of a survey? I'm sorry, was there something else, anybody?
But it would be treated just like the home inspector or something like that. It's not part of, under the mortgage covered, or any of that kind of stuff. It's just an added expense outside.
I'm sorry, what are you talking about? The survey?
It's a survey.
Yeah, so the survey, maybe I'm not understanding the question. Go ahead. Repeat
Well,
that.
if you know, it's like when you get a home inspection, it's like the prepaids, I guess, but it's like the home inspection, credit checks for the mortgage, those kind of things are usually separate expenses that are not wrapped up into the mortgage costs, if I'm correct on that. So the survey, that's just adding one more item in that category, or is it somehow covered within the mortgage expenses?
So I think you're talking about things that are paid outside of closing, like the customarily the appraisal still appears on the closing statement, but it's identified
Right.
as paid outside of closing.
Yeah,
So the survey, no, the survey would be something that would be paid at closing, so it would be a debit to the buyer if a new
Okay.
one is required.
okay, so they don't pay for it in advance to do that, but it's still not a part of their financing. It's an extra cost to the buyer, just like a home inspection would be, or the appraisal, or the credit checks and things like that.
Correct,
It's
except that
just
it would
gonna
appear
show up on the
closing
closing statement. Right. Okay,
Correct. It's going to show up on the closing statement. Like a home inspection doesn't usually show up on a closing statement, but the survey
Correct.
will. The buyer
Okay.
paid a survey at closing, just like a seller would if it had been their expense in the contract.
so it's kind of coming out of the money that they bring to closing.
Well, it'll be added to the money that they need to bring to closing. Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my question was, what if something happens and the buyer doesn't close? Who's paying for that survey that's been done already?
Well, it'll go back to now.
Would that be
Now, this
taken
is-
out to escrow or the?
Well, it's interesting because
Yeah.
there's really not a default or non-default paragraph in this. So it doesn't necessarily state how that would work. So
Would
that
it
would
depend on the title company policies?
Well, you mean who pays for an expense?
So
And
if the
most,
title company ordered the survey,
It's usually the mortgage company that orders. Oh, no, the title company, right?
the title company orders a survey usually, and the lender orders the appraisal.
Mhm.
So the appraisal is usually paid outside of closing or upfront at the time. So if the buyer then doesn't close, the buyer's expense is the buyer's expense. Nobody reimburses the appraisal.
right?
If it's a survey and the buyer defaults, since it was the buyer's expense, then the buyer would still be responsible for it. If the seller were to default, I believe that the buyer would be responsible. The seller would be responsible if they defaulted. But there's really not a default, non-default paragraph in here. So it would have to be a negotiation once the expenses were there and you identify a termination, who's paying for what. It's just like currently we always say, check with the title company to find out if there are outstanding expenses, then identify who's paying for those expenses prior to the distribution of the binder itself.
Correct, because usually the title company orders it right away. Yeah, and they.
No, I mean, they don't order it right away. The title company is going to order it, but they're ordering it on behalf of the individual that's supposed to pay for it. So it depends if there's a default or non-default. Again, this doesn't address non-default expenses or default expenses.
But we can put it back on the seller if we wanted to. I mean, if they accept it.
Well, if you're going to terminate the contract, then you would have to identify what expenses need to be covered.
No,
Who's supposed to
I'm
pay
saying
for
when we're writing the offer, we can switch this from the buyer to the seller,
Switch what from the buyer to
to
seller?
sell the survey. We can add it to,
So you can you amend the closing costs? Yes, you can amend the closing costs. You can remove it from the buyer and put it on the seller, but you'd have to do that either in additional terms and conditions or under other, and you'd have to remove it from the buyer.
Okay. So we would write it in under other for the buyer saying will not be paying for survey, and then add it seller to be paying for
So if
survey.
you're trying to move the survey to the seller at the time of making the offer,
Mhm.
under other, you would write survey and you would cross it off of the buyer expense. I would not recommend.
Okay, I know.
Yes.
You never know.
That's a completely different discussion from who pays for what, if there's a default or non-default and then something doesn't close.
Right.
So. And to Tony's point, where things appear. So since the buyer is now paying the survey, it would appear on their side, it's a debit to them. It adds money to the money that they have to bring to closing. Anything else you want to cover there? Title evidence and insurance. So at least a certain number of days, this is 15 versus 10. If not checked prior to the closing, which is title evidence, a title insurance commitment issued by a Florida licensed title insurer with legible copies of instruments listed as exceptions attached to tier 2, which is the title commitment. After closing, an owner's policy of the title insurance, standard A in terms, shall be obtained and delivered to buyer. If seller has an owner's policy of the title insurance covering the real property, the seller shall furnish a copy to the buyer and the closing agent within 5 days after the effective date. This would be so that the seller could get a credit towards the owner's policy. The owner's title policy premium, title search, and closing services, collectively known as the owner's policy and charges, shall be paid as set forth below. The title insurance premium charges for the owner's policy and any lender's policy will be calculated and allocated in accordance with the Florida law, but may be reported differently on certain federally mandated closing disclosures and other closing documents. For purpose of this contract, municipal lien search means a search of records necessary for the owner's policy title insurance to be issued without exception for unrecorded liens imposed pursuant to chapters blah, 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 in favor of any governmental body, authority, or agency. So we currently have a paragraph that talks about governmental, government, what is it, government loans, or not government loans, government liens, which aren't CDs or HOAs. So this is covering that there. Check 1, the seller shall designate the closing agent and pay the owner's policy and charges, and the buyer shall pay the premium for the buyer's lender policy, or the buyer shall designate the closing agent. So this is a little new for us. Customarily, the seller pays for that, pays for the closing agent. The buyer pays for their costs. This allows the buyer to say, I'd like to take that on by checking the box for the buyer. So check 1, 1, 2, or 3. 3 doesn't apply to us because we're not in Miami-Dade or Broward. That's okay. So you'd be looking at 1 or 2. Is the seller paying or is the buyer paying? Just slightly different. If it were a more competitive time, would the buyer want to pay, right? To make their offer, that should look a little bit. We had things moving around when the market was a little wonky a couple years ago. Survey, so we know at least 5 days prior to closing, there needs to be a survey. And if a survey exists, then they should be able to provide that 5 days after the effective date. The nice thing about this is it does put a deadline on when that previous survey should be submitted to the title company. This does break out home warranty. So at closing, the buyer, the seller, somebody shall pay for a home warranty by, so you identify the company, at a cost not to exceed. I've seen a lot of home warranties identified at $500. Please note, it is very hard to find a standard policy that's under $500
Right.
anymore. Excuse me. So please just check. In American Home Shield, the premium is $720. I can't think the other one's $550. So just know what you're asking for from the seller. Any special assessments, really no difference here. At closing, the seller shall pay full amount. So usually we were saying public body special assessments. That's what I was trying to remember. The full amount of liens imposed by a public body, public body does not include condominium or homeowners association that are certified, confirmed, and ratified. And they will pay the amount of the public body's most recent estimate or assessment for an improvement which is substantially complete. And then we check one or the other. The seller shall pay in installments, or the seller shall pay in full prior to closing. And if neither box is checked, the seller is deemed to have selected paragraph 9F. Shall not apply to the special benefit tax lien imposed by community development district. So, which are they going to do? The seller's going to pay the installments, or they're going to pay in full, right, for any special assessments. Good. So it doesn't. The buyer's not here. Buyer should pay all other assessments. That's the only thing we're referring to.
But we used to have where the buyer, but.
The buyer can pay. Correct. This one pushes it off to the seller.
Which is good.
Disclosures. So this is paragraph, what was our old paragraph 13. So just radon gas. This does have a permits disclosure. So except as may have been disclosed by the seller to the buyer, in a written disclosure, the seller does not know of any improvements made to the property which were made without required permits or made pursuant to permits which have not been properly closed or otherwise disposed of pursuant to section 553. If the seller identifies permits which have been if seller identifies permits which have not been closed or improvements which have not been permitted, then the seller shall properly deliver to the buyer all plans, written documentation, or other information in seller's possession. So it goes a little further in permits, mold, flood zones, elevation certificates, all pretty much the same. Remember, this also goes into coastal barrier resources. So don't forget, there is a coastal construction control line that you need to be aware of. No, the buyer may terminate this contract by delivering written notice to the seller within a certain number of days after the effective date. The buyer shall be refunded the deposit. Again, refunded the deposit. And this is if it's not disclosed. Energy brochure. We still have to provide the energy brochure to our buyers. That's why I keep harassing you. Please send it via email in app files and then submit it to the checklist. As reference that you've sent it. Lead-based paint disclosure still a requirement. Yes, sir.
Doesn't it have to be initial, the energy?
Energy brochure does not have any place for initials. If you would like to add initials to it, I think it's a great idea. But currently it does not require any initials or signatures. Lead-based paint disclosure, homeowners association, community disclosure. Buyer should not execute this contract until the buyer has received and read the homeowners association community disclosure, if applicable. So even more reason, not that you guys don't, but to remember to put in all the documents related to the homeowners association. Property tax disclosure, it was in a separate location, but now it's put into the main disclosures. Foreign investment, FIRPTA, Foreign Investment and Real Property Tax Act, a little more detailed on the responsibility for both the buyer and the seller. And then the seller's disclosure, seller's disclosure. We've been pulling the seller's NEFAR purchase and sale agreement, not putting it in. Seller's disclosure, this is just a disclosure, it's not related to that, that's an additional disclosure. The seller knows of no facts materially affecting the value of real property, which are not readily observable and which have not been disclosed to the buyer. So this is just their disclosure statement. This is not the seller's disclosure. Separate items. We move on to property maintenance and conditions. Anything we want to bring up about the disclosures? Please note that we are in an area that does still require the historic disclosure by the buyer. So 5 nationally recognized historic districts, that should be included. There is not currently a rider for that, so I imagine that the Northeast Florida Association of Realtors will continue to provide that historic disclosure. Remember, sunsetting these forms does not mean that neither MLS nor NEFAR cannot still have additional forms. It also does not mean that a brokerage cannot create additional forms in support of the transaction. Property maintenance, except for ordinary wear and tear and casualty loss. So casualty loss is really defined here. Seller shall maintain the property, including but not limited to lawn, shrubbery, blah, blah. Property inspections. Okay, I think we probably beat this into your head, but just as a refresher, we are in the as-is sale and purchase contract, as-is contract for sale and purchase. So the property inspections and right to cancel, the buyer shall have a certain number of days. It would be 15 if left blank days after the effective date, which is known as the inspection period, within which to have such inspections of the property performed as buyer shall desire during the inspection period. If buyer determines in the buyer's sole discretion that the property is not acceptable to the buyer may terminate this contract by delivering written notice of such election to the seller, prior to the expiration of the inspection period. Excuse me. If buyer timely terminates this contract, the deposit shall be returned to the buyer. Thereupon, buyer and seller shall be released of all further obligations under this contract. However, the buyer shall be responsible for prompt payment for such inspections, for repairs, damages to, and restoration of the property resulting from such inspections, and shall provide seller with paid receipts of all work done on the property. The preceding provision shall survive termination of this contract. Unless the buyer exercises the right to terminate granted herein, the buyer accepts the physical condition of the property and any violation of governmental building, environmental, and safety codes, restrictions, or requirements, but subject to the seller's continuing as-is maintenance requirement, and the buyer shall be responsible for any and all repairs and improvements required by buyer's lender. This is your as-is statement. If it's not acceptable to the buyer, they can walk away. This does not preclude the buyer from requesting repairs or from requesting assistance to offset repairs. It's just saying, look, you are buying this as is. The sellers can still say, you're buying this as is. If they provide the notice, on the 15th day that they would like to have a credit for $5,000 for the repairs that they're not asking the seller to make, and on the 16th day, the seller says, no, we're not doing it. You're still obligated to buy because they've passed the time frame, the inspection period for the buyer to move out, right? Or to remove themselves. So they would have to either identify another way to get out of the contract, or if it's a requirement, or if there are repairs that are required by the lender, they take on those repairs. Right? So
how do we do that in the VA when they're not allowed to pay for repairs?
well, you have your VA addendum, your VA rider, which helps protect them in that.
Okay, so if that happens, then yeah, that they can get out because of the VA right.
Well, potentially. Let's see. So if a VA, you're saying if a VA buyer, well, they don't include them paying for repairs. They can still pay for some repairs.
Yeah, but they have to pay it outside of closing. They can't
Right.
pay it in closing.
Yeah, you can't pay it as part of closing.
Right. Okay.
But a VA buyer can still
Yeah.
can still pay for some
Obviously,
repairs.
it's happening in my
Yeah.
case right now. So
Yeah. Yeah, but it can't be part of the contract.
yeah, because it was as is. Okay, so I was just asking to make sure.
And it doesn't state anywhere in here that you have to provide a copy of the reports. However, we still recommend that if you are requesting some repairs done, even if you're requesting a credit based on repairs that are being identified, we still really recommend that you go ahead and provide a copy of the report. And there's nothing in the contract that requires you to do that, but for good business practices, we would believe that we haven't made it a policy yet, but there's every chance we could, because it's probably the best way to do. In the standard contract for sale and purchase, there are some requirements related to requesting repairs. Walkthrough, inspection and reinspection on the day prior to closing. So it says on the day prior to closing, the closing date, or on the closing date prior to the time of closing, as specified by buyer, the buyer or the buyer's representative may perform a walkthrough and a follow-up walkthrough if necessary. Walkthrough inspection of the property solely to confirm that all items of personal property are on the property and to verify the seller has maintained the property as required in the as-is maintenance requirement. That's all.
And if that day needs to change, you would add a rider for that or put it in.
I'm sorry, if what day needs to change?
If the walkthrough date could not be the day before or the day of, for whatever reason.
So when would it be, you're talking about doing it
Like 2
further in
days.
advance?
Sure, like if for some reason it had to, like if the closing was on Monday and the only day you could do it would be on a Friday, for whatever the reasons are.
Well, I mean, you could do it on a Friday related to a Monday closing without violating the contract, but if you needed to do it earlier, yes, you in writing, you would need to request the time to go.
And an addenda or rider, addendum or rider.
You can do it, no, there's no rider for that, there's currently no blank addendum or blank amendment.
Okay,
So you would just do it in an email.
Okay, but if you did a showing time request for a final inspection, that would be the same thing?
You could do a showing request for that. I would still put it in writing, saying that you're going to request it. I mean, it's a matter of communication. It's better to go ahead and put them on notice that you need to do it at a certain time, either because the buyer is not going to be available, or the buyer is not going to be around, or the buyer is signing prior to closing. Same with a seller. So these are the guidelines for the walkthrough. I would not say that, you know, if you have to do it before, that you shouldn't put everybody on notice. I wouldn't just make a showing request for a final walkthrough. I would probably put them on notice via email and then follow up with the showing request, final walkthrough. Seller assistance and cooperation in closeout of building permits. If the buyer's inspection of the property identifies open or needed building permits, and then the seller shall promptly deliver to the buyer all plans, written documentation, or other information in seller's possession, knowledge, or control relating to improvements to the property, which are the subject of such open or needed permits, and shall promptly cooperate in good faith with the buyer's efforts to obtain estimates of repairs or other work necessary to resolve such permit issues. Permits are still a big deal. This document puts a greater onus onto the seller to ensure that any open permits are closed, and it also puts an onus onto the buyer if they're taking on responsibility for those permits that either aren't closed or aren't completed. Assignment of repair and treatment contracts and warranties. At the buyer's option and cost, the seller will at closing assign all assignable repair, treatment, and maintenance contracts and warranties to the buyer. So if by chance the buyer and the seller agreed to certain repairs, this would hold the seller to providing copies of those receipts back to the buyer to include any warranties that may come with those, and for proof of payment. Both buyer and seller still within this document need to provide proof of payment for things like inspections or repairs completed, so that there is not the opportunity for a lien by a contractor. All right, escrow agent and broker. Any closing agent or escrow agent, collectively known as the agent receiving the deposit, other funds, and other items, is authorized and agrees by acceptance of them to deposit them promptly, hold same in escrow within the state of Florida, and subject to collection, disperse them in accordance with terms and conditions of this contract. Failure of funds to become collected shall not excuse the buyer's performance. Conflicting demands of the deposit are received, or agent has a good faith doubt to the entitlement of the deposit, the agent may take such actions permitted in this paragraph 13 as agent deems advisable. If in doubt as to agent's duties or liabilities under this contract, the agent may, at agent's option, so these are our responsibilities, continue to hold the subject matter of the escrow until the parties agree to the disbursement, or until the final judgment of a court of a court of competent jurisdiction, it's kind of oxymoron, shall determine the rights of the parties, or agent may deposit the same with the clerk of the circuit court having jurisdiction of the dispute. Remember, this is part our responsibility, and then the closing attorney or escrow agent. We don't have an escrow account, so it pushes it to the title company or closing attorney who's holding the monies. This is why we ask you to please, if you haven't worked with a closing attorney or a title company before, and your customer or the customer is electing to put their binder with closing company or attorney that you haven't worked with, please make sure you get from them a written notice of how their process works if there's a dispute over the binder. Most of the closing attorneys and title companies that we work with have a process. Two of them hold the monies for 90 days, allow the parties to discuss. If the parties can't come to agreement, after 90 days, the title company or attorney turns the money over to the state, which is what it's talking about here. But it's not specific in timelines. So make sure that whoever's holding the monies, you know what their plans are to do if there's a dispute over the monies. An attorney who represents a party and also acts as an agent may represent such party in such action. Upon notifying all parties concerned of such action, all liability of the part of the agent shall fully terminate. So except to the extent of the accounting of all items previously delivered out of escrow. So this is a lot more detailed in how the escrow is managed and does a lot greater reference to an outside party other than the brokerage holding the monies. In any proceeding between the buyer and the seller wherein the agent, an agent being the closing agent or escrow agent, is made a party because of acting as agent hereunder, or in any proceeding where the agent interpleads, remember this is interpleader, a process to determine the rights of the funds, the subject matter of the escrow. Agent shall recover reasonable attorney's fees and costs incurred to be paid pursuant to the court order out of the escrowed funds or equivalent. So this would mean that if there are funds, excuse me, if there are expenses, it's going to come out of the escrow funds first, which is same as the way it is now. Agents shall not be liable to any party or person for misdelivery of any escrowed items unless such misdelivery is due to the agent's willful breach of this contract or agent's gross negligence. So much more onus back to the party non-brokerage holding the monies. Professional advice, broker liability. Broker advises buyer and seller to verify property conditions. So this is our hold harmless. Square footage and all other facts hold harmless related to the brokerage and its associates. So tax representation made pursuant to the contract and to consult appropriate professionals for legal, tax, environmental, and other specialized advice concerning matters affecting the property and the transaction completed by this contract. Broker represents to buyer that broker does not reside on the property and that all representations, oral, written, or otherwise by broker are based on seller representations or public records. In bold, buyer agrees to rely solely on seller, professional inspectors and governmental agencies for verification of property conditions, square footage, and facts that materially affect the value, the property that affect property value, and not on the representations, oral, written, or otherwise of the broker. Buyer and seller individually, the indemnifying party, each individual indemnifies, holds harmless, and releases the broker and the broker's offices, directors, agents, and employees from all liability for loss, damage. So this is our hold harmless paragraph. This is trying to get to put everybody on notice that we're going to give them the best information we can, but there are other sources available that they need to go ahead and make sure that they're going ahead and doing their due diligence period also. Remember, there are initials on the bottom of each page. So the app files will be set up for that. Default resolutions, default dispute resolutions. So the buyer default, if the buyer fails or neglects or refuses to perform the buyer's obligations under this contract, including payment of the deposit within the time specified, the seller may elect to recover and retain the deposit of the account of seller, for the account of seller as agreed upon liquidated damages. Consideration of execution of this contract and in full settlement of any claims, whereupon the buyer and the seller shall be relieved of all further obligations under this contract, or seller at seller's option may, pursuant to paragraph 16, proceed in equity to enforce the seller's rights of this contract. So these, and I think I said that there was no default. This is the default. There's no non-default paragraph. So this is where the buyer and seller defaults are identified, and it's basically the same, that the seller can go ahead and collect the binder's liquidated damages. The portion of the deposit, if any, paid to the listing broker upon default by the buyer shall be split equally between the listing broker and the cooperating broker. Provided, however, cooperating broker's share shall not be greater than the commission amount the listing broker had agreed to pay to cooperating broker. So this is that part about that's currently in the listing agreement that says that the listing brokerage is entitled to 50% of any damages that were, 50% of the money that's collected. Seller default, if for any reason other than the failure of the seller to make the seller's title marketable after reasonable diligent effort, the seller fails, neglects, or refuses to perform the seller's obligations under this contract, the buyer may elect to receive the return of the buyer's deposit without thereby waiving any action for damages resulting from the seller's breach, and pursuant to paragraph 16, may seek to recover such damages or seek specific performance. In other words, that would be to sue to enforce the contract. Please note that if the buyer and the seller are at a dispute over the binder and there are no court actions that are levied against the property, the seller can continue to move forward and sell the property, so you can move the property back to active. However, if any dispute levies or liens the property, then the property cannot be put back on the market. So in something like specific performance, suing for specific performance, a seller could not continue to sell or market the property for sale because it's being held as a piece of collateral within the court system. This paragraph 15 shall survive closing and terminations contract. Dispute resolution, so this is slightly different also. Unresolved controversies, claims, and other matters in question between the buyer and the seller arising out of or relating to this contract or its breach, enforcement, or interpretation, dispute will be settled as follows. The buyer and the seller have 10 days after the date of conflicting demands of the deposit are made to attempt to resolve such dispute, failing which the buyer and the seller should submit such dispute to mediation. So very different. So if the buyer and the seller can't within 10 days agree, then it goes to mediation. Mediation is through the board. Buyer and seller shall attempt to settle disputes in an amicable manner through mediation pursuant to Florida rules for certified and court-appointed mediators and Chapter 44 of the Florida statutes as amended, which is the mediation rules. The mediator must be certified or must have experience in real estate industry. Injunctive relief may be sought without first complying with paragraph 16b. Disputes not settled pursuant to this paragraph 16 may be resolved by instituting action in the appropriate court having jurisdiction of this matter. So here's where we get into some challenges, is that if we have dispute, it's saying that over the binder, then in order to resolve that, they have 10 days, the buyer and the seller have 10 days. If we had an escrow account, we'd have an obligation to the Florida Real Estate Commission. Since we don't have an escrow account, we don't have an obligation to the Florida Real Estate Commission. However, we've just reviewed the responsibilities of the escrow attorney or title company holding the monies. Now we have to identify, well, how is the dispute going to be handled? So I would imagine either they're going to create a termination and release a binder form for Florida Realtors, or we'll continue to have ours available to us, which that would be prima facie evidence of a dispute between a buyer and a seller. But at this point, that works for 10 days. Then we're automatically saying we're going to go to mediation. But here's the deal: we'd have to go through the board to get mediation, which is available. That's not a problem. But once you start that process, it can be ended if by chance the buyer and seller, once you started the process of mediation, If the buyer and seller come to agreement, then the mediation can be canceled. Otherwise, you're going to move forward with mediation, and the buyer and seller are going to sit across from the table from each other and discuss how they want to disperse these funds. Right? So it's a slightly different process. The NEFAR purchase and sale agreement assumes a brokerage has an escrow account. This more often assumes that a brokerage does not have an escrow account. But it pushes resolution to mediation. So if there are concerns, again, please make sure that you're getting something in writing from the title company or attorney that indicates what the method is for resolution of a dispute over a binder that they put into place. Because you could have two things working at the same time, right? Because if you've got the title company saying we hold it for 90 days and then turn it over to the state, you've got the buyer and seller at least negotiating over here, either through mediation or potentially within the first 10 days, then this can trump what happens to the monies here. Or if it takes time over here with the mediation, you may have a timeline that you have to kind of watch in order to ensure that everybody's made aware of what the process is it's going. Attorney's fees and costs, so the parties will split equally any mediation fee incurred and any mediation permitted by this contract, and each party will pay their own costs, expenses, and fees, including attorney's fees incurred in conducting the mediation. In any litigation permitted by this contract, the prevailing party shall be entitled to recover from the non-prevailing party costs, fees. So that's if we go further. Standards, so here are some of the standards they were referring to previously. Standard A is related to title. So title evidence, restrictions, easements, limitations. Again, very similar. Is the seller able to provide clear title? And is the state able to provide a title policy? Are there any exemptions to the title policy? So the title commitment with legible copies of instruments listed as exceptions attached here 2 shall be issued and delivered to the buyer. The title commitment shall set forth those matters to be discharged by the seller at or before the closing, and shall provide that upon recording of the deed, the buyer at owner's title policy of title insurance in the amount of the purchase price shall be issued to the buyer, ensuring the buyer's marketable title. It's comprehensive land use, zoning. You've got restriction matters appearing on the plat or otherwise common to the subdivision. You've got outstanding oil, gas, mineral rights. You've got unplatted public utility easements. So this is all covered in here. Taxes for the year, very similar to what we currently have. Taxes provided, more uses of the property for residential purposes. If there exists at closing any violation of items. So this does not discuss zoning. There is a rider for zoning for a zoning change. So if for some reason the buyer would like to rezone the property and is making that a contingency in the contract, you would need that rider that addresses zoning changes. We're going into item 2 of A, which is the title examination. The buyer shall have 5 days after receipt of the title commitment to examine it. So this is slightly different from what we're used to here. Examine it and notify the seller in writing, specifying defects, if any, that render the title unmarketable, right? If the seller provides the title commitment and it is delivered to the buyer less than 5 days prior to the closing date, the buyer may extend the closing for up to 5 days after the date of receipt to examine the same in accordance with standard A related to title. The seller shall have 30 days to cure any similar time frame. Nothing different there. If seller cures the defects within the cure period, the seller will deliver written notice to the buyer with the proof of cure acceptance acceptable to the buyer and the buyer's attorney, and the parties will close this contract on the closing date, or if the closing date has passed, within 10 days after the buyer's receipt. So it does lay it out. I would still recommend an amendment so that everybody's aware. If the seller is unable to cure the defects within the cure period, the buyer may, within 5 days after expiration of the cure period, so that gives them an additional 5 days after the expiration of the cure period, deliver a written notice to the seller, either extending the cure period or electing to accept the title as it's currently written with its defects on it, So if after reasonable diligent effort, the seller is unable to timely cure the defects and the buyer does not waive the defects, the contract shall terminate, the buyer shall receive a refund of the deposit. Standard B relates to the survey. If the survey discloses encroachments of the real property or that improvements located thereon encroach on the setback lines, easements, or lands of others, or violates any restrictions, covenants, or applicable governmental regulations described in Standard A, A1A, or B, or D above, the buyer shall deliver written notice of such matters together with a copy of the survey. So these things are supposed to be delivered so that the buyer can review them. The seller also has an obligation, once they know, to disclose them at that point. If the buyer timely delivers such notice and survey to the seller, such matters identified in the notice and survey shall constitute a title defect, subject to the cure obligations of Standard A, again, Standard A being title, or in B, which is survey. If seller has delivered, so if the survey impacts the title, since the preparation of such prior survey, the extent of the affirmations therein are true and correct. Ingress and egress, so much more detailed here. Ingress and egress, the seller represents that there are no ingress or egress of the real property. Lease information, seller shall at least 10 days prior to closing. So this is, remember, this is, if it's leased, NEFAR is currently within 5 days of acceptance. This is at least 10 days prior to closing. Furnish the buyer the estoppel letters. So currently we identify rent rolls. Estoppel letters are written letters indicating that the tenants are in good standing. Estoppel letters from the tenant or tenant occupants or occupants specifying the nature and duration of occupancy, rental rates, advanced rent, security deposits paid by the tenant or tenants or occupants, the estoppel letter, which is known as the estoppel letters. If the seller is unable to obtain such estoppel letters, the same information shall be furnished by the seller to the buyer within the time period in the form of a seller's affidavit, and the buyer may thereafter contact tenant or tenants or occupants to confirm such information. So if the seller is not providing what's needed in a timely manner, or even once they've provided it, if the buyer wants to check with the tenants, they can do that, which is a little different. If it's because they're supposed to have provided the leases. If estoppel letter or letters or seller's affidavit, if any, differ materially from the seller's representations and leases provided pursuant to paragraph 6, or if the tenant or tenant's occupants fail to or refuse to confirm the seller's affidavit, the buyer may deliver a written notice to the seller within 5 days after receipt of such information, but no later than 5 days prior to closing date, terminating this contract. So if the buyer can't confirm the information that's been provided or is getting a difference of information, and they can't confirm the information, or there's nothing to support the information is consistent, they can cancel the contract. And that's up to 5 days prior to. This is for properties leased. Now remember, leased properties could be on a short-term lease, 6 months or less, could be on a long-term lease, 6 months or more, 12 months. If there are short-term seasonal rentals, you need that rider, plus any pre-booked stays. You'd have to negotiate those. Does the seller get a portion of those fees? And that all has to come out through that, not only that seller rider, but what that seller requires to be done. Excuse me, seasonal rider, what that seasonal rider. Lien seller shall furnish to the buyer at closing an affidavit attesting to the absence of any financing statement, claims, liens, or potential lienors known to the seller, and that there have been no improvements or repairs in real property for 90 days immediately preceding the closing date. Well, remember, there could have been repairs, even though it's an as-is. If there were repairs that were done, we want to make sure that those repairs were paid for. If the real property has been improved or repaired within that time, the seller should deliver releases or waivers of construction liens executed by a general contractor, subcontractor, suppliers, materialsmen, in addition to the seller's lien affidavit, setting forth the names of such general contractor, subcontractor, suppliers, materialsmen, further affirming that all charges or improvements or repairs which could serve as a basis for construction lien or a claim for damages have been paid and will be paid at closing, or will be paid at closing. So watching for liens. Time is of the essence in this contract, so we're sticking with calendar days based on where the property is located shall be used in computing time periods. So it even says here, based on where the property is located. So if the buyer goes out of the country, that doesn't mean that the time shift doesn't, that the time frame doesn't now shift to wherever they're at. Other than the time for acceptance and the effective date as set forth in excuse me, in paragraph 3, any time periods provided for or dates specified in this contract, whether pre-printed, handwritten, typewritten, or inserted herein, which shall end or occur on a Saturday, Sunday, national legal public holiday, as defined in 5 U.S.C., or a day of which the national legal public a day on which a national legal public holiday is observed because it fell on a Saturday, Sunday, or federal Saturday, Sunday, shall extend to the next calendar day, which is not a Saturday, Sunday, national legal holiday, or a day on which a national legal public holiday is observed. Okay. Same. If it ends on a Saturday, Sunday, or federal holiday, national legal holiday, it moves to the next non-Saturday, Sunday, or national legal holiday.
So that's all time-wise.
All timelines.
Okay, I know. 'cause
Just now,
before
same
they
thing as
were-
us.
Yeah.
Same thing as the NEFAR.
I don't know why it was.
Well, maybe it was national versus federal in definition. It says national legal. It says national and federal. I mean, I would assume that it would be any, like tomorrow's a legal holiday.
Yeah.
So what's Juneteenth tomorrow?
Oh,
Excuse me, so it is a legal holiday. So if something ends, if you have a contract where a time period ends tomorrow, it moves to Thursday.
wow.
Yeah, I had a
Now-
closing that I was gonna put for Wednesday and the title company's like, just make it Thursday so there's no confusion.
Force majeure, again, mostly related to conflicts. Buyer and seller shall not be required to exercise or perform any right or obligation under this contract or be liable to each other for damages as long as the performance or non-performance of the right or obligation or the availability of services, insurance, or required approvals essential to the closing is disrupted, delayed, or caused or prevented by a force majeure event. And then it goes ahead and defines force majeure. Hurricanes, floods, not that we have to worry about them. In this area, extreme weather. Is heat extreme weather?
I
I guess
they
if you have-
closed,
I guess if you have rolling brownouts or something like that, it could be. Unusual transportation delays. New York. Wars, insurrections, civil unrest, or acts. So all those things we don't like to talk about. But the force majeure paragraph is very similar to what was covered in the NEFAR. It extends the time period, or actually I should say, in the NEFAR one, it was 10 days. In the Florida Realtor one, it's 7 days after force majeure event. If it goes longer than the period of time, more than 30 days, that's consistent. Beyond the closing date, then either party may terminate this contract by delivering written notice. So difference 7 versus 10, but 30 days max is the same. Conveyance, seller shall convey marketable title to the real property by statutory warranty, trustees' personal representatives or guardian deed. This section, this standard H, appeared in the very first paragraph of the NEFAR document. So it's here is appropriate to the status of the seller. Standard A, remember this is title, and those accepted by the buyer, personal property shall, at the request of the buyer, be transferred by absolute bill of sale. So this even reminds us that if there's property that's being transferred, it should be done in a bill of sale, even if the bill of sale is 0. We're moving on to standard L, which is the closing location. Am I going too fast, or is everybody okay?
Okay.
All right, okay. Closing location, documents, procedure. Not a lot to fill in these last few pages, but making sure we're aware of the different contingencies or standards. These are now identified as standards. Closing will be conducted by the attorney or other closing agent designated by the party paying for the owner's policy and the title insurance, and will take place in the county where the real property is located. Doesn't mean you can't still have mobile notaries. Closing documents, seller shall at or prior to closing execute and deliver as applicable deed, bill of sales, certificates of title, or other documents necessary to transfer title of the property. Construction lien affidavits, owner's possession and no lien affidavits, so a little more detailed, and assignments. Most of this has would already be, while not identified in the current NEFAR purchase and sale agreement, these items usually are reflected back in the ability of a title company to produce necessary title documents. Seller shall provide buyer with paid receipts for all work done on the property pursuant to this contract. Now notice it's saying that that's the second place it's mentioned work done on the property within 90 days, one here pursuant to the contract. So you can see that that the inspection period does not preclude a buyer from asking a seller to do something. It's whether the seller wants to, and then what's the buyer's opportunity to get out if they don't want to take the property without those items being addressed. FinCEN GTO reporting obligation. Let's just say FinCEN because now they don't put FERPTA in here, and I just like to say FERPTA, so now I'm going to learn to say FinCEN. If the closing agent is required to comply with the U.S. Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, sounds pretty bad, geographic targeting order, GTO, FinCEN, then the buyer shall provide the closing agent with essential information and documentation related to the buyer and its beneficial owners, including photo identification and related to the transaction contemplated by this contract, which are required to complete mandatory reporting, including the currency transaction report, and the buyer consents to closing agent's collection and report of said information to IRS. So now FinCEN, there you go.
That's one question.
Yeah.
It goes back up to the location.
Yeah.
The title
Go back.
company has to be in the county of the real property,
Title company doesn't.
the insurance. What is it?
The person, so the location, it's saying that the closing agent.
Oh,
So if the
the
title
location.
company is outside
Yeah,
of the
'cause I know there's
area,
a lot, so I'm
they
wondering.
provide
Notary.
they provide a remote
Well, no,
closer.
usually I mean, they have to pay for the notary, so are you saying if they're not here, then they don't have to pay for the notary?
If who's not here, then they don't.
Like if the seller, or no, if the buyer. If the title company that has been picked is not in Duval County or St. John's or something like that,
Right.
usually the party that is here has to pay for a notary. Are you saying that they would not have to, or?
I mean, I haven't seen the party that's, usually if the title company is located other than our metro area,
Mhm.
the title company provides a closer that comes to the
Yeah, but they
closing
usually
and performs
charge
the
it.
closing, and the charge goes to the title.
Oh, okay, they've been sometimes adding it on.
The only time I've seen it given to an individual is when there were multiples, like the title company would pay for the first one, but that there were multiple, they had to do multiple remote closings.
Okay.
And then the party that needed the remote closing was charged for those additional
Okay.
closers, but the one
One.
closer was paid by the title company because they aren't located here.
Okay. Thank you, so.
Everybody having different experiences?
Cash,
Are your customers charged for the remote closer?
cash closers, if it's a cash transaction.
If it's a cash transaction, I'm sorry, what?
Yes, if it's a cash transaction, I have seen that done, yes.
Where your customer is charged for the remote closer.
Yes, sir. Mhm.
Okay. So make sure to review that then. We're seeing it both. Procedure related to, sorry, where were we? Consent procedure. The deed shall be recorded upon collection of all closing funds. If the title commitment provides insurance against adverse matters pursuant to this section, As amended, the escrow closing procedure required by standard J, which is the next one, shall be waived, and the closing agent shall, subject to the collection of all closing funds, disperse at closing the brokerage fees to the broker and the net sale proceeds to the seller. So this gives them the right to go ahead and disperse those items. But we still will be producing commission disbursement authorizations. If appropriate, certain title companies will not take those. And in those situations, the check must come to the brokerage and then we'll auto deposit those, your funds. Escrow closing procedure, if the title commitment issued pursuant to paragraph 9C does not provide for insurance against adverse matters as permitted in section 627 of the Florida statutes as amended, the following escrow and closing procedures shall apply. 1, all closing proceeds shall be held in escrow at the closing agent for a period of not more than 10 days after closing. 2, if the seller's title is rendered unmarketable through no fault of the buyer shall within 10-day period notify the seller in writing of the defect of the seller, and the seller shall have 30 days from the date of receipt of such notification to cure the defect. Right, this goes back up to item A, title, and of course we've already identified that if a issue comes up, then they have the 7 days, or they have the 30 days to fix it. And if they can, and that takes you past closing, then you'll close within 7 days of that, or from the time they fix it, you'll close within 7 days, unless that 7 days is before the originally identified closing. This is saying is if we find something title issue at that last minute, then that can extend. Prorations credits. So the following recurring items will be made current, or excuse me, yeah, will be made current if applicable and prorated as of the day prior to closing date or date of occupancy if occupancy occurs before the closing date. Real estate taxes, including special benefit tax assessments imposed by a CDD and assessments imposed by special districts pursuant to Chapter 189 of the Florida statutes. Interest, bonds, association fees, insurance, rents, and other expenses of property. The buyer shall have an option of taking over existing policies of insurance if assumable, in which event premiums shall be prorated. Cash at closing shall be increased or decreased as may be required by prorations to be made through the day prior to closing. Advance rent and security deposits, if any, will be credited to the buyer. Escrow deposits held by a seller's mortgage will be paid to the seller. Taxes shall be prorated based on the current year's taxes. If closing occurs on a date when current year's millage is not fixed, but current year's assessment is available, taxes will be prorated based on such assessment and prior year's millage. If current year's assessment is not available, then taxes will be prorated on prior year's tax. If there are completed improvements on the real property as of January 1st of the year of closing, which improvements were not in existence on January 1st of the prior year, then taxes shall be prorated based upon prior year's millage and an equitable assessment to be agreed upon between the parties, failing which request shall be made to the county property appraiser for an informal assessment taking into account available exemptions. This is most often referencing new construction. However, this document is not usually used for new construction unless it's new construction that's hired one of the brokerages as a listing agent or hired us as a listing agent. In all cases, due allowance shall be made for the maximum allowable discounts in applicable homestead and other exemptions. A tax proration based on an estimate shall at either party's request be readjusted. So at either party's request be adjusted upon receipt of current year's tax bill. This standard K shall survive closing. Standard K is this one related to prorations and credits. That includes taxes. Access to property to conduct appraisals, inspections, and walkthrough. The seller shall, upon reasonable notice, provide utilities, service, and access to the property for appraisals and inspections, including a walkthrough or follow-up walkthrough if necessary prior to closing. So our current current purchase and sale agreement talks about having utilities on for inspections. This doesn't address that other than to provide utility service. Again, we're seeing a few more short sales, but not running rampant. Risk of loss, if after effective date, but before the closing, the property is damaged by fire or casualty, and the cost of restoration, which shall include cost of pruning or removing damaged trees, does not exceed 1.5%. So it's half of what the NEFAR document is at. 1.5% of the purchase price. Cost of restoration shall be an obligation of the seller, and the closing shall proceed pursuant to the terms of this contract. If restoration is not completed as of the closing, a sum equal to 125% of the estimated cost to complete the restoration, not to exceed 1.5% of the purchase price, will be escrowed at closing. If the actual cost of the restoration exceeds the escrow amount, the seller shall pay such actual cost, but not in excess of 1.5% of the purchase price. An unused portion of escrowed amount shall be returned to the seller. If the cost of restoration exceeds 1.5% of the purchase price, the buyer shall elect to either take the property as is, together with the 1.5%, or receive a refund of the deposit, thereby releasing the buyer and the seller from all further obligations under this contract. The seller's sole obligation with respect to the tree damage by casualty or other natural occurrences shall be the cost of pruning or removal. So this is really different because it takes it from 3% to 1.5%. Plus it pushes more obligation to the buyer. Plus it doesn't say anything about insurance proceeds. So if there were damages and the buyer wanted to move forward, it limits the sellers to 1.5%. So just something to consider. Hopefully we don't have this very often. I've only seen it a few times. But just know the risk of loss for loss. This is our loss casualty damage paragraph. 1031 exchange, same, no difference. If it has to be 1031 like kind exchange, uses a like kind exchange moderator or mediator or intermediary, depending on how you look at it. Not usually done by an attorney or title company. It's usually a company specific to it. There are a certain number of days you must identify properties and a certain number of days in which to close. Contract not recordable. Persons bound, notice, delivery, copies, contract. Neither this contract nor any notice of it shall be recorded in any public or official records. This contract shall be binding on and inure to the benefit of the parties. Don't know that word, inure. I'll have to look that up. The benefit of the parties and their respective heirs or successors. So this is the only time we see that. In interest, whatever the context permits, singular shall include plural, and one gender shall include all. Notice and delivery given by or to the attorney or broker, including such brokers, real estate licensee, representing any party, shall be as effective as if it were given to the party. All notices must be in writing and may only be made in mail, facsimile transmission, personal delivery, or email. A facsimile or electronic copy of this contract and any signatures hereon shall be considered for all purposes as an original. The contract may be executed by use of electronic signatures as determined by Florida's Electronic Signature Act. So in here, it's slightly different, but you know, that electronic notice to you, even though it's also going to the other party, is still electronic, is still notice, and can establish an effective date. Integration and modification. This contract contains the full and complete understanding and agreement of the buyer and seller with respect to the transaction contemplated by this contract, and no prior agreements or representations shall be binding. So very similar to one of the disclosures in the NEFA. Waiver, failure of buyer or seller to insist on compliance with or strict performance any provision of this contract or to take advantage of any right under this contract shall not constitute a waiver of other provisions or rights. Riders, addenda, typewritten or handwritten provisions. Riders, addenda, or typewritten or handwritten provisions shall control all printed provisions of this contract in conflict with them. So that's will mean that they supersede. Collection or collected. Collection or collected means any checks tendered or received, including deposits, have become actually and finally collected and deposited in the account of the escrow agent or closing agent. Closing and disbursement of funds and delivery of closing documents may be delayed by closing agent until such accounts have been collected, or excuse me, such amounts have been collected in the closing agent's accounts. T is reserved. I'm sure there'll be a T later. U, applicable law and venue. This contract shall be construed in accordance with the laws of the state of Florida, and venue for restoration, or for, excuse me, venue for resolution of all disputes, whether by mediation, arbitration, or litigation, shall be in the county where the real property is located. I still get to say FERPTA, so don't forget FERPTA. If it's a foreign investor in real property, there are requirements for them. This is much more detailed on what defines a foreign investor and the responsibility of the seller. So you can see if the property, real property, is a foreign person as defined in FERPTA. So there's an internal revenue code that's dedicated to this. No withholding is required under section 1445 of the code if the seller is not a foreign person. Seller can provide proof of non-foreign status to the buyer by delivery of written certification. If the seller is a foreign person and has received a withholding certificate from the IRS, which provides for reduced or eliminated withholding in the transaction and provides the same to the buyer by closing. So if prior to the closing, the seller has submitted a completed application to the IRS for a withholding certificate and has provided to the buyer the notice required. So buyer and seller both have requirements here when the investor is a foreign investor. This is not an individual with a green card, just so you know. If prior to closing, the seller has submitted a completed application to the IRS, so they have, and a foreign investor has to go through these steps to ensure that they have paid their taxes and that funds are not going to be required to be held from closing in order to pay either taxes or items that they would owe to the IRS. If prior to closing, the seller submitted a completed application, what happens? No withholding certificate has been received. How do we proceed? The buyer's option, timely remit the withheld funds to the IRS. So you're going to have to, if the individual is a foreign investor, the title company should be able to manage this process or assist in management this process. You may have to extend the closing if there's an issue with the payment, or if the IRS is not providing the proper paperwork, or if it's going to take longer for them to provide the proper paperwork. W, standard W is reserved. Buyer waiver of claims is X, standard X. The buyer waiver of claims, to the extent permitted by the law, the buyer waives any claims against the seller and against any real estate licensee involved in the negotiation of this contract for any damage or defects pertaining to the physical condition of the property and may exist at closing of this contract and be subsequently discovered by the buyer or anyone claiming by, through, under, or against the buyer. It's a waiver that's in there, but you can see from a couple of the other paragraphs, they still have rights related to at the time of, during, and after the contract. Then we've got our addenda and additional terms. These are all the riders that are outlined. So please remember there are certain ones you're going to need to use. Condo rider for condos, any homeowners association, if there's seller financing being provided, if there's a mortgage assumption. This VA financing, VFHA financing, again, provides the appraisal contingency. If you want an appraisal contingency on conventional or cash, if it's a short sale, homeowners association, these reserved items here, I, K, and L, those are reserved. However, if you look at the standard contract for sale and purchase, those items exist. These items these riders on the standard contract for sale and purchase change the standard contract sale and purchase to an as-is contract for sale and purchase. Defective drywall, coastal construction control line, insulation. Before I forget, I think I mentioned earlier, maybe not. There currently is not a coastal, or excuse me, a CDD addendum. Lease purchase, lease option. Again, all of these things like the lease purchase, lease option, occupancy prior to, where's the occupancy, those all do require an additional document be produced by a third party. Not, again, we don't recommend using third-party documents related to these items created by another brokerage. It should be by a third party attorney or title company. I'm sorry, Bonnie?
Lovely.
V is the sale of a buyer's property. Backup contract, kick-out clause. Backup contract and kick-out clause are slightly different from our continued marketing addendum. The kick-out clause is more related to our continued marketing addendum that we've been using. Seller's attorney approval, buyer's attorney approval. This is if the buyer or the seller would like their attorney to review. Licensee property interest, so there's a rider for that. Binding arbitration, mostly related to receipt of funds or expenses, related to usually commissioner compensation. Paragraph 20 is your additional terms and conditions. So here we've already talked about, do we put descriptions of items that remain? Do we put exclusions? Do we put movement of the survey? Whatever additional terms and conditions, and you may find others. There is nothing in the riders that indicates that there is a counter. This a counter addendum. This is your counter offer addendum here. Seller counters buyer's offer. That begins the process of the counter going back and forth. Remember, counters in this are defined as live for 2 days unless you change them.
So in the counter on this, are we doing strikeouts for counters, or is there's not an amendment? You can't.
So the question is, are we doing striking through items if we're countering? Because there's not currently an amendment, or excuse me, yeah, an amendment to the contract.
I mean, in one of the classes, they said yes until it gets unreadable, and then you, once you agree to something, you have to, because.
I was at the meeting.
Yeah.
They were at the meeting that we do every month, and they said, yeah, it's okay, and I could see the taste, this taste, I didn't like that.
I'm hoping that they'll come up with a counteroffer addendum or a counteroffer, excuse me, a counteroffer amendment or a blank amendment that can be used for counteroffers.
Yeah.
It is, you're correct, it's not uncommon for people to cross items out. The challenge is when you cross something out, it has to be initialed and dated. And I can't tell you how often I see initials that are not dated. So then you go back to the last date, and then sometimes it creates an argument between, well, when was the initial done and when was the signature done, or what truly is the last date. This is why I think blank amendments are probably the best way to summarize all of your changes. You can summarize all of your changes on the additional terms and conditions. You can summarize all of your changes on, and I imagine we'll keep the blank amendment. You could still use that. So even though it's a NEFAR document, you can still attach it to a Florida bar or Florida Realtor. Yes, go into here and cross things out, but you're exactly right. After the first change, it's going to become unreadable. I even had an agent ask me, well, couldn't I just replace the pages with clean pages? I'm like, ooh, please don't do that. Please don't, like, well, can't I replace just pages 1 and 2 with clean pages? Yeah, I really wouldn't recommend that.
At that point,
So-
you just rewrite the whole thing if everyone's in agreement.
Yeah, if everyone's in agreement, you could rewrite, but still rewriting, things get missed, just like amendments. So, I mean, I'm a big proponent of summarizing all the changes on an amendment, but if we don't have one, then scratching out and crossing through. But just please remember to get initials and dates And if it's unreadable, then you need to summarize it in something, whether it's a page that you attach, that you call summary of changes. As long as you put signature blocks on on that, that still can be attached, and you reference in additional terms that can still be there, still valid. And they talk about in writing still being valid. Facsimile, electronic signature, but they didn't talk about texts, right?
Would it be reasonable to say to the seller if they do counter, could we do it in a blank? You know, instead of them crossing it out, or that's something you can't really ask.
Well, so often what happens is the buyer side will present an offer,
Right.
the selling side will then scratch through things and send it back to the buying side. At that point, if the buying side just elects to counter, it would probably be best to have something that summarizes all the
Okay,
changes
so,
rather than continue to make changes to the items that the selling side has already made changes to, and that we can no longer see. I just reviewed an offer where they were doing that scratch out on an as is, and I couldn't tell what the actual purchase price was.
right,
Because
yeah,
I've gone through so many times.
Right,
Okay.
and they had changed not only the purchase price, but they had changed the amount to bring to closing. They had changed, so it was hard to even add up because I couldn't get clear line on
right, yeah, so.
what those numbers
Yeah,
were.
to prevent that, so if they do cross out stuff for the first initial counter, I can initiate the
Sure,
summarized version of it.
on an amendment.
Okay.
And you can even write it on a piece of paper and you call it an amendment.
Oh, okay.
So, I mean, if
Just
there's,
put
if
initials in.
Florida Realtors doesn't offer us an amendment, a blank amendment, and NEFAR says we're not going to continue offering the blank amendment, then I would create a page and call it an amendment with a date and signature blocks and make sure that everybody's aware. But I mean, think of me as your alien, because I have to look at everything that you guys create and I have to figure out what you're trying to communicate. So I'm like your best sounding board. If you get to a place and I look at it and I go, I have no effing idea what you're trying to say.
Yeah,
Yes.
I
So
don't-
if you don't understand it, how's the title company, how's everyone else gonna
Right,
understand?
how's the underwriter, how's the lender, how's, well, not, I shouldn't, I mean, I'm the low person, I'm the low denominator, I'm the one, if all of them understand and I don't, then that's setting your bar. I'm the low bar, so use me to make sure that everybody else understands.
so as of right now, though, we don't have an official amendment.
Well, as of right now, we still have the blank amendment that
Oh, we
NEFAR
have the
provides, yeah, until the 30th.
Oh.
Of the 30th. And if they continue to provide that, then we can still continue to use it. Absolutely. The remainder of this page is intentionally left blank, just so you're clear. And then we go into the seller and buyer notices, conveyance to foreign buyers, wiring. Oh, no wiring. Sorry, that was no wiring thing. Okay. And then the signatures by all parties. Very little information related to us. Again, we're not a party to the contract, so it would just be our basic information. I think that covers their acceptance of it. And we're down to page 13. So this is the time that we're looking at, unless there are counters, but some kind of changes in the timeline, a lot more legal ease in here. Some things are much more well defined, like the foreign investor, but less defined on things like personal property and less defined on things like occupancy. So, and a lot less defined in the as is on the management and maneuvering of inspections. Remember, it's 15 days for everything. Inspections, if by chance something comes up and you want to see if the seller is willing to, everything has to happen within that default of 15 days, unless you put a different number in there. Survey. Any other observations people want to bring up that they've heard, seen, or have come to their attention? Anybody? Okay. Well, thank you for taking a little extra time. I know we've gone about 15 minutes over. We kind of went through at a high level trying to identify some of the changes. Hopefully, a few of you have taken courses through NEFAR or through one of our title companies or title partners. If you have observations, if you have comments that you feel would like to have shared but don't want to do it in this environment, or questions, please send them to me via email so we can make sure that we can get them addressed. We are in the process of revising all policies. I think I've probably said it 100 times if I've said it once, but we're hesitant to put out policies until we get some of the finalized documents, just to ensure that they're the most recent. We're not sending you updates, revision 1, revision 2, revision 79. So if you have suggestions, if you have questions, if you have other things that you've heard, if I've misspoken something, you feel I've misspoken something, please let us know. This is still learning for all of us. I'm trying to absorb as much of it I can from a variety of different conversations and classes, as well as give you the best guidance possible, or offer the most opportunities to discuss these forms. Again, let us know so we can share it with everybody.
Can you help us come up with a new timeline? Like, you know how sometimes you like to summarize timelines to share with the other agent and the title company and everything like that. Because it seems like the timelines are gonna be very, like, there's more of them.
There are more things. I mean, in this one, they're laid out in here. Some of the different timelines are laid out in here. I'm sorry, to answer your question. Yes, we have that spreadsheet that we hand out that has, you put in a date and it calculates the deadlines for you.
Oh, okay.
And we're looking at changing those days so it makes more sense related to this. But yeah, so that's one of the resources that we would like to enhance once we get the final timelines. But sure, I mean, absolutely, it's looking to work with you on as is. And then sometime we did receive an offer on a standard sale and purchase, standard contract for sale and purchase the other day. So there are people using it. Remember, the big difference in that one is it outlines a lot more detail as it relates to inspections and the responsibility, the financial commitment of the seller as it relates to repairs for WDO inspections and lender required.
If you want us to use the as is.
Our company will be using the as is. And obviously you can use a standard. Our preference is that.
It's a lot easier.
And there are quite a few changes or updates. Anything else? Anybody wants to comment? Okay. Well, y'all are wonderful. I appreciate you taking time. I'm gonna stop sharing and I'm gonna stop the recording. And if there's anything that you guys need, just go ahead and send it via text or email. And we're good to go.